welcome everyone. My name is Ashley Klein-Jimenez. I am with PreventConnect in Calcasa, and I am so thrilled to invite you to this conversation with our friends at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence today, looking at messaging the connections, explaining the links between strengthening economic support and preventing sexual and intimate partner violence. PreventConnect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or Calcasa. So with that, we do have some objectives today. We are, really wanting to kind of dive deep into the connections between strengthening economic supports and preventing multiple forms of violence, identify some of the language and narratives that can be used to message the connections to stakeholders and partners, and then look at some of the opportunities to really expand what it means to strengthen economic supports to prevent violence. So that is what we are here to do today. But I really want to start off with highlighting the CDC technical packages. I'm going to put a link to where you can find the technical packages. And just briefly, if you're not familiar with the technical packages, these are reports that are a compilation of a core set of strategies that are really meant to, achieve reductions in specific violence risk factors or outcomes. So the strategies that are outlined in the technical packages can assist prevention practitioners in being able to prioritize prevention activities. And it's all based on the best available research in terms of what we know works to prevent violence. There are 6 technical packages available to access, and you should be able to follow the link in the text chat and find those. And they include technical packages on preventing sexual violence, on preventing intimate partner violence, on preventing adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. There's a technical package on child abuse and neglect, on suicide, and on youth violence. And you only see 5 technical packages here. And that is, so we move to the next slide. What we know from the research and from the technical packages is that strengthening economic support shows up as a strategy in 5 out of the 6 reports. So I believe it is the preventing youth violence technical package that strengthening economic supports does not specifically show up in. But in the other 5, as you'll see in this table, strengthening economic supports is really a cross-cutting strategy for multiple forms of violence, including sexual violence and intimate partner violence. And well, we know that the research is telling us, but the question still remains, how do we explain to partners and stakeholders how strengthening economic supports can lead to reductions in multiple types of violence? And I think one place to start, and one thing that the technical packages really lay out very well, is to think about the conditions that are shaped by economics. So for example, in every technical package, along with the strategy that's being presented, there is a paragraph or 2 about the rationale. And so in the IPV technical package, the rationale shows us that strengthening economic supports for families, it explains that poverty, financial stress, and low income increases the risk for intimate partner violence. So if we focus on reducing financial stress for families, that might then lead to a decrease in the potential for relationship conflict and dissatisfaction, which we know are both strong predictors of intimate partner violence. And we'll talk about this more as we go through the presentation, but it's really a multi-step explanation. And so I think that that's something that, as practitioners, it's important for us to just kind of accept up front that it's a multi-step explanation and connection. If we move to the next slide, we know that in some ways the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic outcomes that are being experienced by many people and communities may make those links between economic supports and preventing violence easier for people to connect. The gaps that exist in how individuals and families are being supported or not being supported by programs, practices, and policies are really more clear than ever. So the title of the article that we have on this slide, this is an article that appeared in the New York Times a few weeks ago, and it's titled, "In the COVID-19 Economy, You Can Have a Kid or a Job, You Can't Have Both," really speaks volumes about the economic stress and systemic gaps that folks are experiencing. But at this point, Casey and Arlene, I'd really love to pass this conversation over to you all, because I know that economic justice has been such an important part of your equity and anti-oppression work. So I'd love to pass it over to you and have you share a little bit about that.
Unmute. Okay. Thanks, Ashley. And yes, that's been a major part of our work. And Casey will talk some about the intersection of housing and domestic violence and sexual violence and racism. And towards the end, we'll provide some resources that specifically address the strengthening economic support that we'll be talking about. But I'm just excited about the presenters. So I'm waiting to hear what they have to offer, strategies, information, all of that. But in response to COVID-19, in addition to talking about economic support, at the National Resource Center, as we're talking about messaging, as we're talking about narrative, as we're talking about the stories that we're crafting now, language is important to us, right? So as we know, prevention is all about fostering thriving individuals, families, and communities. And in the midst of COVID-19, we have experienced how COVID-19 has impacted marginalized communities in disproportionate ways. So as advocates and as preventionists, we're thinking now about, and we're supporting individuals to think about, how do you pivot your work? Right? How do you pivot your work to respond to lessons that's been learned? So Ashley, somebody made a shift, but that first slide, I think, is where the conversation should happen. It's important that we acknowledge and we communicate that certain individuals face multiple and intersecting forms of structural and injustices and discrimination. So what does that mean for our work moving forward? What does that mean for our work as advocates? What does that mean for our work as practitioners, right? When we know that in order to end domestic violence, we have to dismantle these systems. We have to dismantle the systems that perpetuate racism, anti-Blackness, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and all the other forms of structural oppression that we know exist. And this is our work, right? So this is the moment to make the connection for the field as practitioners, as preventionists. This is the time, right? However we craft our story, however we craft our work and our response will impact our work and our movement for decades and generations ahead. So I think it's important that we do that. Some key lessons that we have been focused on at the National Resource Center, I'll touch on two, and then I'll pass it over to Casey, is that Black and Brown communities presently have been experiencing overwhelming number of risk factors, right? We know this. So how do we balance that out with investing in protective factors that, in addition to strengthening economic support, we're also paying attention to connectedness, community connectedness, community care. We're also promoting equity. We're also centering the needs and lived experiences of marginalized communities. We're also investing our resources in these areas, in these spaces, in the prevention efforts that's happening within organizations now, within grassroots organizations, and how do we support these individuals in these organizations to tell their stories, right? So we have some great presenters that's going to share their stories with us. I'm looking forward to that. But I think the other lesson is that the siloing is breaking down. We're all talking to each other now. And I think this moment, this time is a gift. Because as we talk about supporting survivors and advocates, as we talk about creating brave spaces, as we talk about economic, strengthen economic support, we're also talking about dismantling bias systems, right? So we're talking across movements now. We're talking within movements, practitioners and advocates. We all have the same goal of creating safe and thriving communities. And what does that look like? So now that the silo is broken and we're all talking to each other, I think it's important that we continue and we build on that moving forward as we talk about prevention. So I know we talk about risk and protective factors. We'll talk more about that. Presenters will talk more about that. So I won't take up a lot of time, but I just wanted to offer one example for the show that comes on. What is it? United States of America. Every time that show is going to come on, I hear this phrase that says a zip code can tell you where a child is going to end up. And the people that's communicating that is probably not thinking about prevention. But every time I hear that phrase, every time I hear them say it, my prevention hat comes on. So I think that's the moment that we're in right now. And as we can provide language, and the presenters will provide some language around how do we articulate, right, the importance of economic support for families in order to prevent violence from occurring in the first place. So the next slide, it challenges us, right, to think about, redefine we. What does the collective we look like? How do we do our work? How do we pivot our work to continue working together on these issues instead of the silos, instead of just talking about one issue and not the other issues? So we're actually living intersectionality through a prevention lens. And I'm really excited about that. And with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Casey now to, again, talk about the work that we've done at NRCDV to address the various intersections and how we create prevention language around the intersections of all these various injustices and oppressions that particular communities are experiencing. Go ahead, Casey. Thanks.
Thank you, Arlene. And that was just so beautifully framed. I am so grateful. If we can go to the next slide. We just wanted to take a minute to highlight one project in particular, and that's the Safe Housing Partnerships Project. That is a consortium that the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence is part of. And they have just released its new moving infographic that explains the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness. And we felt was particularly relevant to the topic today. So Ashley or Tori, can you help us out? So I'm not hearing it.
Tori, could it be because you're on mute?
Yeah, I just unmuted myself, so let me...
Great.
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and more, experience compounded barriers that further homelessness and housing instability. A recent study found that 66% of people experiencing homelessness were Black, while 28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the U.S. general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member places an extra strain on family resources. Oftentimes, we tell a survivor experiencing homelessness to go to a relative or friend's house. However, network impoverishment can cause immense burdens on the existing limited finances and available support from that network. Racial disparities arise at every juncture, from the legal system to housing to healthcare to child welfare to public benefits. Understanding the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity, survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial inequity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it so we can do more about it together. To learn more, visit safehousingpartnerships.org.
Thank you so much. And I would encourage, all of you to, visit the website to learn more about those resources and that project. And yeah, please advance to the next slide. I'll only take one more minute just to say that, from our vantage point, economic justice, anti-poverty, utility rights, housing rights, wage equity, health equity, employment rights, voter rights, closing the digital divide. All of this work is racial justice work. And all of this work is really necessary to prevent the power-based violence that exists at all levels of the social ecology. We see this work as the foundation of the prevention work that we do. And our work to end gender-based violence really connects to all movements that are working to dismantle power-based violence. We are just one part of a much larger movement, and at the root of it all is racial inequity. So unless our prevention work directly addresses these roots, we'll never make progress to real social transformation. Today, we're talking about strengthening economic supports, and that work really does live at the intersections of racial and gender justice. As Arlene said, I'm really excited to hear from the presenters today and understand more about how the positive outcomes of economic justice work really connect directly to the protective and promotive factors that prevent gender-based violence. And I want to highlight too that at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, we believe that if we center the lived experiences of survivors of color in order to end systemic racism, we will attain safe and thriving communities. So we believe that the change we wish to see is really only possible if we prioritize and value Black lives. So I'll pass it back to Ashley.
And I think just really quickly to add to that,
yes.
It just, this moment, these pandemics, these several pandemics, just challenges all of us, right, to show up different and to be different. And what does that mean for our practitioners, and what does that mean for preventionists?
Thank you, Arlene.
Thank you so much, Arlene, and thank you, Casey. Appreciate you both and this framing that you have brought to this conversation. The links, the different things that you mentioned, I did pop links in for folks in the text chat. So you can learn more and access those. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the conversations that we had planned to have, we have to have this other lens of kind of like the current context around COVID-19, and some of it, it hasn't changed. It's just made things a little bit more clear for folks. So thank you all so much. We do want to move forward and hear from you all in our audience, and we'd really love to know what you're currently doing to address economic supports in your work to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence. And maybe you're not doing this work yet, and that's fine too. We'd love to maybe know how you're thinking that you might incorporate addressing economic supports. But if you would use the text chat and let us know, what are you doing? What are you thinking? How are you talking about this issue and how it relates to your work? We'd love to see that. And while you are answering that question, I'm going to actually invite Tori to well, first I want to let you all know, so these are our guests that you're going to be meeting today. We have Lisa Finaldi. Lisa is the Community Engagement Leader at the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation, Family Forward, North Carolina. And then we have Megan Simmons, and Megan is the Senior Policy Attorney at Ujima Incorporated, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. And we are just so excited to have Lisa and Megan here. I want to just introduce them to you up front, but then we are going to be hearing from them individually. But Lisa and Megan, thank you for being here with us. We are excited that you agreed to join us for this conversation. Tori, now I am going to pass it over to you so you can introduce us to Lisa, and we can get into the good stuff.
Thanks, Ashley. And thank you, Arlene and Casey, for all of that wonderful information in the framing. I think that set a really good tone for the conversations we're about to have. So, Lisa, we are so excited to hear from you about the economic support that you're doing with the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation and Family Forward North Carolina. Lisa is the Community Engagement Leader for the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation, leading the North Carolina campaign for grade level reading and the Family Forward North Carolina initiative. She is an experienced nonprofit leader at the state, national, and international levels. Welcome, Lisa, and take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is my volume good? Great. I'm really excited to be here today because the more we can cross over and show where our work intersects, the more we're going to get accomplished. So I wanted to just start with the next slide and tell you briefly about the campaign. Family Forward is an initiative of the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Foundation is one of our supporters, and also the North Carolina Institute of Medicine. And that grant does come from the CDC. So there is a good relationship there, I noticed, with some of the technical reports that you showed earlier. Next slide, please. So the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation is focused on policies for children birth through age 8. And I'll tell you why that's so important in a minute, but our work is around public policy, but also around practice and what can be done in lieu of public policy as we're all working hard to change public policy. So the next slide. Our Family Forward campaign is not a public policy campaign. We're actually working directly with business leaders to help them find research-based and industry-appropriate policies that will increase productivity, recruitment, retention, but also help grow our economy. And in terms of what my organization is about, support the healthy development of children. And so that's why we talk about our slogan is business smart, it's family friendly, and also it's future ready. So we're looking towards the future with our families. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the story and how we devised our story. So our value proposition, I think, is quite simple, that if we can tell an employer how they can gain a competitive edge in their business, they're all ears. Now, before the pandemic, in North Carolina, our unemployment rate was 3.2%. And we had a very large skills gap in terms of people qualified for the jobs of today. And so everyone was looking to have that edge. And so we had a tremendous amount of interest from businesses to work with them on how they could change policies that support workers as well as children. And then we're telling them that by taking these steps, they are also helping to support the future workers in our country. And so people who have a sense of patriotism in our country, or really are are thinking about the future in our country, while it may be hard today to think about that, they are feeling that sense that it's not just about them, it's about the future, and that these benefits are both short-term for them and long-term for the nation. Next slide, please. And then the story goes this way, and I'll go through it with you, but the story starts with what is the state of young children in North Carolina today? Many people don't know that. They know their family, they know their neighbor, they know their school. What is a family like in America today? Again, a lot of people have no sense of what a family is. We also highlight the lack of supports for working parents. And so when you look at what a family today is and what a working parent is, you can see how we're lacking in all kinds of supports. And then we give data on how that actually impacts their participation, both their ability to participate and the quality of their participation. And most importantly for this conversation, that it impacts future earnings and therefore the economic mobility of a family or an individual. We also share these policies that are research-based. I'll tell you more about them later, but every policy had to meet 3 criteria for us to really use it in our work. And that was that it had a business, an employee, and a child outcome that was positive. And then we're telling stories by writing case studies around businesses who are making change. And we're looking for stories that are out of the ordinary. So maybe a restaurant, you wouldn't think that they would have very good policies around family friendliness. And so we interview the employer. They have to show us what their policies are. And then we interview an employee to talk about how that policy has made a change in their family. And this helps inspire others to think, well, if they can do it, why can't I? Next slide, please. So then we really start with a story about children that a lot of people don't recognize. Arlene talked about the zip code. We don't talk about that. We talk about the opportunity, which is that brains are built, they're not born. And so we have other slides that show how the rapid development happening in these early years is absolutely amazing. You'll see in my last bullet there, those early brain development, children are having neural connections at a rate of 1 million synapses per second. And so the synapses that connect because of a positive early experience, those get stronger, but some will just fade away, or a negative experience can have a negative impact on synapses. And this end of 3rd grade test, unfortunately, can really predict academic achievement and career success. So this is why we're talking about how important these early experiences are. We know the effect of ACEs on children. Even recent information from the CDC is showing that ACEs have an impact on life health, and that some of the top killing diseases in our country, like diabetes and heart failure, are linked to, in many cases, are linked to ACEs. Next slide, please. So as I said earlier, we tell people a little bit about what's going on in our state, and this is not very different for anywhere that you live, unless you live in Mississippi, who has made some incredible progress in the past few years. But we see some of the lowest percentages of our students meeting ACT scores, and also our 4th graders are reading below levels. If you disaggregate the data by race, you will see more shocking information for sure. The reason I put it this way is because in order to disaggregate it, we have to use state data rather than the national data. And so that just causes some problems with that. Next slide, please. So when we talk about how families are changed and workplaces haven't. And the next slide really describes a little bit more about families. Oops, sorry, there's a little out of order here. Yes, here we go. So this is just an example of what's happening with parents. So, and the latest figure we had is 2016, but we have 2 million parents who are making choices about work because of childcare. And so in North Carolina, 62,000 people made a choice to quit a job, not take a job, not take greater responsibilities in a job that can affect their economic status because of childcare. And also the Federal Reserve has shown that 5 million more workers could be in the workforce if more family-friendly benefits were offered. And so, we did have a worker shortage before the pandemic, and we will see that again because we do not have enough people who are qualified and have the education required for the jobs of the future, which are far more technical than they are today. Next slide, please. So we've created a guide to family-friendly workplaces, and on our website, you can see that guide, and we will drop down and I'll show you a little bit about what's in there. But this is really the basis for the work. We have both a printed guide that we use in presentations when we go out and talk to businesses, but also everything is online for you to see and to take. Next slide, please. So when we go out and talk to businesses, we're usually in a setting for chambers of commerce, economic development people, workforce development people, folks who are making decisions about what businesses and what work looks like in a community. And we're trying to really get out to more rural places where people are more challenged, because these are places where people have more low wage jobs and often are people of color. So we found 16 benefits that had those positive outcomes that I mentioned earlier for employers, parents, and children. And we put them into 5 categories around leave, scheduling, health and wellness, childcare, and accommodations and support for pregnant and women coming back to work after pregnancy. And so the 3 in the blue are the ones we're going to talk about today, because we have found that as a result of COVID, I think it was mentioned earlier that some things really have been highlighted about how bad they were before and how broken many of our systems were before. And more people now recognize that as a result of the situation we're in today. Next slide, please. So this was supposed to be up a little further, but what I was mentioning about what's happening with families and working parents. And you can see that people who are in part-time work, are in low-wage work, often public-facing work, therefore have to go to work, have the least opportunity for paid sick leave. Now, we know that during COVID, paid sick leave mattered a lot. People were going to work sick or weren't being able to take care of a family member. So we are focused a lot on hospitality and accommodations. And as you can see, people in the lowest wage quartile, which is, on average $13 an hour, really has very little opportunity for these leave policies. Next slide, please. And so in North Carolina, again, not something that isn't happening in your state, childcare infrastructure is fragile before, and now it's worse. We have people who own and operate childcare centers making very low wages, $21,000 a year. Many of them are older women of color. The expense for families is extremely high. People who work in these centers don't have health care. We've seen a lot of negative outcomes as a result of COVID. And so the situation's even worse now. We had childcare deserts in 99 out of our 100 counties. Centers are closed. As I said, the cost is crazy. You'll see it on the slide. And the lost earnings in a state from revenue, from tax revenue, from people's individual income, is being lost in a significant way because of these problems. And so childcare is really one that's been raised to the surface. And I will say that part of the reason why we know this hasn't been an issue that's been addressed properly is because really up until now, women have not been the majority in the workforce. And now we are. And I feel like this is a moment between the pandemic and women taking over the workforce that this will change. And it has to change because people can't go back to work and people will be stuck in economic situations that are not positive for them. So the next slide, please.
Thanks, Lisa. And I think that sets a really good stage for us to then talk about, so what does it mean to prevent violence through these through these policies, and I know Rebecca brought it up much earlier in the chat, how for those of us who work in violence prevention, it seems intuitive, right? Like, if we fix these systems that were built on white supremacy and racism and patriarchy and sexism and misogyny, if we fix these systems to be equitable, or we work around these systems to have equitable solutions, then we're creating those norms to prevent against violence. There's also some functional things about policies that do have a direct impact on preventing perpetration of violence, and preventing folks from experiencing violence. So Lisa, you know about these workplace policies, and I know about the connections to the shared risk and protective factors for prevention. So if you wouldn't mind, sharing some of these specific policies and supports that Family Forward North Carolina sees as the opportunities to strengthen families, I'm happy to chime in and highlight some of the shared risk and protective factors I see in those policies.
That's great. So after I do a slide, we can wait and see what you might have to add.
Of course.
Okay, perfect. I also just wanted to say, while everyone's thinking about this, is that, we live here in North Carolina in a fairly, we're a swing state, so that tells you a little bit about it. And so part of this work is to really reach people where they are, while our partners who are advocates are working towards, policy change. So we're kind of tilling the soil to get people around this idea that these policies matter for the future of our state, for people, for the economy, so that it will be easier for people, in the halls of our General Assembly to make change. And we've had some big things happen. I mean, all state employees now have access to parental leave for, I believe we're up to 8 weeks now. So in a state like North Carolina, that's actually a big deal. And it's had a knock-on effect for the Justice Department, for universities. So progress is being made in the public policy arena too. So looking at leave, as we mentioned, I just want to mention here, because it's highlighted, safe leave. When I go out and talk to people, almost nobody has any clue about what safe leave is. So I think that's an important one to maybe start talking about more. Everyone just knows about parental leave or family leave, but sick and safe are not really, don't seem to be so much in the domain of businesses. So every one of the policies in the guide is listed this way. You see what the policies are and then what the results can be. So if you're a business person, it's all about productivity, recruitment, retaining the best people you can find. It also increases the likelihood that employees will stay there. And then we get into the things that are more related to workers and children, around reducing infant mortality, increasing educational attainment, which obviously links directly to getting out of poverty, decreasing maternal depression, improves the family income, allows workers to care for children and for themselves and for children in a crisis, and the decreasing of stress.
Thanks, Lisa. And as you move through these, I am moving through the slides so folks can see in bold, what are those factors that link a little more either directly or indirectly to preventing intimate partner and sexual violence. So you should see those in bold on your screen now.
So as I mentioned, we give some examples that we believe are meaningful in our state. So we have a lot of military bases in our state. And so this is an example of a woman who was trying to have a business right near a military base, and everybody kept being transferred who worked there. And so she was making leather handbags. And so she came up with a program that she has full-time, she has contracted employees. She has all the leave, including military leave, that's necessary for families in her community. And she's also created a telecommuting, and she means like not coming back telecommuting. So if a family gets transferred, they take their sewing machine with them and they're making leather goods from, a distant location. So again, talking to some conservatives in our state, this is the kind of story that they listen to. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so this is about scheduling. Everybody knows about flexible work, and if you didn't, you certainly know now as a result of COVID. But another one is really about predictable scheduling. So people who are in the gig economy, many of them get their schedule, 10 days ahead of time. So if you're a working parent, how are you making a schedule for your child? Or maybe you have to go to a wellness visit with them, or heck, go to the school play to see your child participate. And so without that kind of prediction, it makes it very hard to be a working parent, especially if you're a single parent or, a caregiver in a single family situation. So you can see, again, a lot of these things are similar to the other one. Obviously, absenteeism reduction is one that matters in a lot of workplaces. That one comes up on childcare too, where families just can't show up or they're late because of things related to care. And then again, you see these ACEs reduction, stress reduction, and just generally, when parents can find more time for their children, they're supporting their children's health and well-being and their academic achievement as well. So I mentioned earlier that we want to give examples. Again, a restaurant and a hospitality, a local company in Charlotte that can actually give paid time off, can give that predictable scheduling, provides insurance. It's somewhat out of the ordinary in this profession, and these people have to be at work. They're public-facing jobs, and they're usually low wage jobs. And we now see that the paradigm is shifting, in that people are looking at completely different ways to run restaurants because they have to. So we have some stories here that we're about to tell about restaurants who are raising the wage to what's considered a livable wage here, which is $15 an hour, and putting a premium on the menu, and just telling people when the server arrives at your table to tell you, we have a premium on our meals because we're now paying our workers a fair wage. And that, I believe, is changing as a result of COVID. And then the last one I said we talk about is childcare. We know the situation is crumbling. So many facilities are not able to reopen and never will be. And that impacts families, workers' ability to go back to work. So I think the ones that are a little different here are really about academic achievement. When you have that great start, if a child is in a quality care center, it could be a home-based center. It doesn't have to be, Bright Horizons, but when it's quality and it's licensed, that's what matters. Now, subsidizing childcare can really help people, and really almost any income bracket you're in, unless you're in the highest levels, people need that kind of support. It also helps childcare centers because they know that if the company down the street is subsidizing care, then they have an outlook about what the child count is going to be at their facility. And there's these other ones as well: backup, emergency, and on-site care.
Great. And, childcare is super, a super intense need for folks right now. That's, part of the framing that we started off with too, talking about in the COVID-19 economy. Can you have a job and a child at the same time? Is your job providing that flexibility while childcare centers may or may not be operational, or depending on where you're at, if it's safe virus-wise for children to be in childcare? And it does have these pretty direct impacts on preventing violence throughout the lifespan, with improving education and graduation rates, reducing stress, and again, that bottom line factor that we're looking at on this web conference is improving family economic security too. So Lisa, I'll hand it back to you to go through your example.
Yeah, I think we're just about done. So furniture and textile manufacturing is a very important historical part of North Carolina's economy. And while it's decreased a lot as a result of trade agreements, we do still have quite a few companies. And this one makes high-end furniture for Tommy Bahama, and they put together furniture for Tommy Bahama, and also Mitchell Gold has their own line of furniture. And so in a fairly rural place, they have an on-site childcare, and they've had it for 20 years at their facility. And parents pay for it, but it's at a fair rate, and it's on-site. And if you see, there's also an on-site health and wellness center for employees and their families. And so just the stress reduction and your ability to show up at work and really be there physically and mentally has changed everything at this furniture manufacturer. So we always put them up as just a great example. And right now we're in the process of writing a few more studies because no one sort of believed that you can do this. And I think I'm close to done. Next slide. And so really just in closing, again, on our website, you could look at all of these guides. There's a bunch of data about why it matters, as you can imagine, that's changing rapidly. And would love to talk to anybody if you're interested in hearing more. And we're just trying to tell a very different story given where we live and where we work. So I really appreciate your time, and thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. It's really great to hear about the, 2 steps or more that we have to think of when thinking about how these policies impact violence. And it was so great too to hear, what are the stories that are resonating with your local community and your community partners? I think that was really impactful. You're getting a lot of claps, snaps, and congratulations in the text chat for everything that you had shared previously. So thank you. Before we move forward and hear from Megan and the work of the Ujima community, we want to hear from you all. In what other economic policies do you see protective factors against sexual and intimate partner violence? Lisa had shared a few that Family Forward North Carolina is specifically focused on, and how you can pull out those protective factors from those economic policies. And when we say economic, you all know by now we're being very, very, very broad when we talk about that. So please let us know in the text chat. I see Sarah Bear has already started the conversation with breast/chest feeding policies in the workplace. Absolutely. So keep them coming. We want to hear, what sparked your imagination? What sparked some thought for you? And Ashley, I want to hand it off to you to introduce our next guest.
Thanks, Tori. Thank you, Lisa. So I'm really excited to introduce you all to Megan Simmons. Megan is a senior policy attorney at Ujima Incorporated, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community. Megan actually presented on a previous PreventConnect web conference that happened not very long ago, preventing violence in our homes, meeting this moment with connection, care, and justice. And we just really love the way that Megan, how you talked about economic justice and the connections to racism and what's happening during COVID-19 and the work that you all are doing to prevent violence against Black women. And Megan, just really quick, I want to share with everyone that you have done a lot of work around policy and advocacy. Megan served as a federal agent and was tasked with investigating sexual assault for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS. And Megan conducts various trainings on sexual harassment, investigation, execution, diversity and inclusion, and also presents guest lectures for the Women and Gender Studies Department at George Mason University. So Megan, we're so happy to welcome you back to PreventConnect. And I would love if you wouldn't mind to start us off by sharing about the work that you all are doing at Ujima Incorporated and sharing a little bit about what that work looks like.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Like we discussed, my name is Megan Simmons, and I am currently working with Ujima. We're a culturally specific organization and a project of the DC Coalition on Domestic Violence. We settle the voices of Black women specific in the Black community. We try to make sure that folks are aware that we're not a monolith, and we're always cognizant to lift up the voices of the Afro-Latinx community, the LGBTQ community, and individuals that are African immigrants, as well as African American women here in the U.S. Kind of moving on to the slide, what we do, we give voice to Black women and girls. We provide a supportive community to Black women and girls, and we engage women, men, and children. That is some of what we do as a whole. I spend most of my work on policy. Well, a myriad of things now. We've all been talking a good bit about COVID and how sometimes our work has to shift. Most of my work is based in policy, but of course I am still supporting efforts as it relates to COVID and how it intersects with all of the other things that we do at Ujima. So just to tell you a little bit about our areas of focus, we spend our time on sexual violence, domestic violence, community violence, and institutional violence. People are holistic, and we have to approach these kinds of concerns in a well-rounded way. So we're always cognizant that, particularly in the Black community, women, you have the intersection of being a woman as well as being a racial minority, being Black. So these words, these focuses or areas of focus, just like we have been discussing, the economics are very, very broad. They can touch on the economy, public health, all of the things that could be seen as barriers for folks making healthy choices for themselves.
That's great, Megan. As I mentioned earlier, and I forgot to put a link in the text chat, but I will do that now. We recently worked with you on a web conference really focusing on COVID-19 and violence prevention. And we got to learn that, much of your policy advocacy work focuses around economic supports. And I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about how that decision to need to focus on economic supports to prevent violence, how did that come about?
Well, it's important to discuss the economic dependence piece, because we know that economic dependence can be linked and often is linked to violence. When you have situations where 80% of Black mothers are the key breadwinners in their families, that means that, one, as it relates to equity in their pay, they need those funds. Of course, all people should be paid for their work, but it matters a lot. And it's really important to ensure that they're able to make those healthy decisions without regard to, am I going to be able to pay with concerns about some of the things that we've already discussed, housing and childcare and food insecurity and the like. So again, you have to be cognizant of the person in a holistic way. And those kinds of things are added stressors in the house and can make people, unfortunately, find themselves in uncomfortable, unhealthy, and unsafe environments.
Thanks, Megan. Will you walk us through, I know that you all are focusing on numerous areas around economic support. So will you walk us through what some of those are?
Sure. If you can forward to the next, there we go. Thanks. One of the things that I'm spending a good bit of time with right now is the Crown Act. As it says it here, the Crown Act is anti-discrimination law that prohibits discrimination as it relates to hairstyle, texture, and type. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. I've opted to wear my hair essentially in its natural state. And as a Black woman, that was taboo for many, many years. So much so that it can impact you economically. Women have reported, being seen as unkempt or seen as unprofessional. Again, being able to hold their own as it relates to the academics, as well as the employment experience. But again, essentially being pushed aside or not elevated in their place of work because of what their hair looks like in the event that it looked as it did, the way that it grows out of their head. So California was the trendsetter, and they were the first to enact state law to basically outlaw discriminating against individuals based upon their hair. We have many states that are that have legislation written and are waiting to see if it's going to go to committee and then pass. And there have been several other states, 6 other states that have codified language to ensure the same thing. So the hope for me is to work with a lot of these state legislatures, and I have been in contact with many of them, to gain some momentum. We have seen national policy introduced in the Senate, I believe. And so the hope is that eventually this will become federal law. Some of the other things that I work. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to let people know I'm going to post links to these areas of focus for Ujima so folks can learn more, and so that it's part of our text chat transcript. So those are coming in your text chat as Megan speaks.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I did provide you all with some of the links just in case you wanted to visit some of these websites to take a look at some of the articles that I've read, or take a look at some of these websites or different things that folks are doing to support these kinds of efforts. Here, just spending a little bit of time with small business and entrepreneurs. This was something that I wanted to highlight. African-American women are the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs in the United States. That's a pretty big deal. We cannot, I would just be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about COVID, because how much it is impacting the Black community from a health standpoint, as well as from an economic standpoint. Although these women have been growing in entrepreneurship and small business, ways to sustain themselves and their families in the event that, they could make it a little bit more easy, give some relief to barriers as it relates to the economic portion. Unfortunately, these businesses are underfunded and usually don't have the requisite capital, and they lack access to oftentimes banking institutions. I'm a little concerned, and I'm going to be spending some time researching the effect that the lack of PPE loans that were distributed to small businesses, and in particular the Black community, has affected this growth. It'll be interesting to see if there's a decline as it relates to the growth of Black female entrepreneurship. I highlighted these 2 particular organizations. One is called Sisters in Business. Essentially, it was a part of an effort to remove hindrances for Black women that had created businesses that couldn't go to some of these more expensive expos because they just didn't have the funding. This gave them something a little bit more economically sound and a little less expensive for them to showcase their businesses, whatever they may be, get the word out there that they were making good products or providing good services. This particular business, the expo, is actually appears to have expanded, and they're offering even classes now for folks to get a better understanding of how to access funds and how to run businesses, how to start them up. And then this particular, this is a Netflix documentary talking about several Black women that have created businesses for themselves. Talks a little bit about the trials and triumphs of moving forward as it relates to being a Black woman in business, and how they were perceived and what kinds of things they had to do to, again, grow as an entrepreneur, making them much more independent. Economics and healthcare. I think, again, I would be remiss if I didn't have some conversation about COVID as it relates to the economics and healthcare. I spent a good amount of time on Black maternal health and some of the implicit biases that have been experienced by Black women as it relates to their health, how they have been treated by individuals in the medical profession. This slide provides you a little bit of the statistics. And I also like to always point folks to a study that was provided by the Black Women's Blueprint. And it provides extensive research discussing how interpersonal violence is linked to Black women and Black maternal health. I also work with different stakeholders in partnership as it relates to some of the things that we have seen that can be impactful to our health. Instances wherein people aren't held accountable for harms, or again, the implicit bias that we've talked to, policy that speaks to that, policy that continues to have hold people accountable, identifying what are best practices, and making sure that folks are really doing what they should as it relates to Black bodies, as it relates to Black bodies in the healthcare system. We've seen with, again, the ongoing pandemic that overwhelmingly Black folk have been impacted by the trauma that comes along with interacting with healthcare professionals, when they don't get the care that they need. And oftentimes, again, that's linked to insurance or lack of funds that they may or may not have had as it relates, again, to the treatment that they're receiving. This one may be familiar to some. There has been a move towards not taxing tampons. This gives you some ideas of what essentially having a menstrual cycle will cost. And so we want to make sure that, again, this isn't something that is impacting people, women in particular, in a financial way. This is something that occurs naturally every month. There was no choice here. And so we just want to make sure that we do as much as we can to, again, move that particular barrier. Some of us may take these things for granted, but, again, you can see how much these things can cost full scale. And it gives you a better appreciation of what that might mean for someone that's a low wage worker, or someone that is homeless, or someone that is having to make decisions between medications for their children, medications for themselves. So we want to ensure that they're not being, again, taxed.
Thanks, Megan. Megan, quick question for you.
Sure.
The documentary about Black women entrepreneurs, I don't know if you mentioned what the title was. Do you remember?
I'm sorry. I think it's She Did That. Pretty sure it's called She Did That.
Cool. I will look it up and try to find the link. Thank you.
I have the. Forgive me. I put the link in the notes for you. Just want to talk a little bit about the family structure and housing. So again, we've talked a little bit about this already in the presentation, but housing is expensive. You will all be provided with a article that'll provide a little bit more information about how expensive housing is for all of us, and essentially most people can't really afford the housing costs that we're experiencing. Many people are living in multi-generational dwellings, not necessarily all the time because of choice, but sometimes because of survival. People have to pool funds and they have to utilize the resources they have with extended family, parents, and everyone working together to care for elderly parents, as well as small children. We talked a lot about already about childcare, its costs, how it can be a burdensome to parents, particularly and in particular families and women that are not making the funds to pay for the charges incurred as for health, for childcare. And so again, it's kind of like an ongoing cycle. You have the family there, the older people have to take care of the children, the family, the working adults are trying to make as much as they can, but sometimes, again, particularly in communities of color, they're not making enough to make ends meet. Again, these are added stressors into the household. And with the ongoing pandemic, social distancing, while we all, of course, want to make sure that we're doing as much as we can to socially distance, sometimes it becomes a question of privilege because these individuals don't have the option. Black families over-index as it relates to essential workers. We're thinking about folks that are working at grocery stores and EMTs and the like. Those people, live with other people and can't really distance themselves from them, almost even if they want to, because again, they'll need the child care and they're pulling those funds to ensure that they will have a roof over their head. Again, the economic impact provides a big stress in the household. College accessibility and long-term affordability. So African American women are the most educated demographic in the United States, but African American women that we graduate with the highest amount of educational debt. So essentially, it becomes a situation wherein you've gone off and you have decided to educate yourself, to set yourself up for success for high-paying jobs. That says there ends up being an overwhelming, almost debilitating amount of debt assessed to you because typically you don't come from a family wherein they were able to just write a check and pay off whatever your education costs. You graduate only to find that you're not really making the money to pay back the loans, and then you make enough to pay, but again, you're accruing interest. You've graduated with more loans than most other folks, so you have the degrees, but you often wonder. You find yourself wondering, was it all worth it? Because again, you're saddled with all this debt. As you can see here, Black women see their educational debt continue to increase over the years, again, due to the interest rates. And so again, that becomes a barrier to you because had you not gone and gotten the education, then of course you would be relegated to a lower wage job. Whereas you go out and you get the education and you get the formal training, and then you're not only are you saddled with the debt, but as we talked about at the top of the slides, you're not being paid equitably to everyone else.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Megan. I really appreciate the way that you broke down how all of these various economic factors have an impact on women in the Black community. I think that, when we're talking about economic supports that prevent against violence, we only have the peer-reviewed research on a few types of policies. But what I really appreciate about what you just shared is drawing those connections between this is the system as it currently operates, this is how it's impacting people. And going, even beyond the usual suspects when we talk about economic supports, and especially on this last slide, talking about the college accessibility and long-term affordability, and the impacts that student debt has. on folks' ability to keep the income that they make. So thank you for making all of those connections for us. I know that the way that you all make these connections is through this operationalizing these policies. You know, it's out there at the societal level, but what does it look like down at that individual level? What is that individual level impact on folks? So, you know, why is it important for people to operationalize policies like economic supports when looking at their impacts on preventing violence?
I think it's important because it gives you an opportunity to address some of these institutional concerns from a holistic perspective. We just had a conversation about economic impact, but it included housing, it included education, it included childcare, it includes, you know what I mean? So it looks at the person. I think continuing to support and advocate for things like the Crown Act, things like pay equity to ensure that people are getting paid the way that they're supposed to be paid or in an equitable manner. I think it only helps to relieve some of the barriers that encourage folks to sometimes choose situations that are unsafe, unhealthy, or can be violent.
Absolutely. There's so much that could be done to remove those economic barriers. And with the policies that focus on anti-discrimination, like the Crown Act, or like any of the policies that you mentioned, it shifts our social norms to ones that are more equitable. So really appreciate you bringing that into the conversation, talking about removing those economic barriers. So we want to pause for a second and bring it back to our participants. You all just heard a really great overview from Megan of how policies reduce economic barriers that can prevent violence and promote equity. So how else can you see policies? What other policies are you making connections with? I'm going to recycle the phrase again. What sparked your imagination for using economic policies to prevent violence and promote equity? So thank you, Ashley, for pasting that question in the text chat. And I want to invite Lisa back and Megan as well. We want to hear from you all. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to mash both of the questions together and then give the floor back to you. How do we shift the work we are doing to look more broadly and help meet needs that we are seeing now that are related to economic justice? So how do we, for folks who are working in violence prevention, how do we make that shift to an economic justice lens? And also, what opportunities do you see to expand your work? So Lisa and Megan, whoever wants to start that off, I will let you go for it.
Well, I was thinking about some really basic policies around, minimum wage. That crosses over so much of what so many of us are doing. Sometimes I feel like we're in our own boxes and we're working on it this way and you're working on it that way. So just finding some things that have resonance with everyone. I mean, who can afford to live on a minimum wage in this country today? It's just impossible. So I try to think about those. What are the ones that can really galvanize a lot of people from different, coming at it from different ways?
I actually am inspired by Lisa. I think, doing more as it relates to childcare, making sure that people are not paying like exorbitant, taking that stressor off of families as something new that I could work on in the future and something that I would like to see even more on. I think, during her presentation, just this furniture company, has done some very innovative things. I think also doing even more in the diversity and inclusive, from the diversity and inclusive lens, I think that will then guide policy, because then you will have folks at the table. You'll have women, you'll have Black women, you'll have other women of color, and those voices will be heard. I think sometimes if you're not at the table speaking to the things that are impacting you, then people, well, at least they can say that they don't know. So more representation, but more inclusion of all in the process of the policies.
I think that one's excellent, Megan, because, all of these corporate conferences that some of them I have to go to, and the diversity and inclusion, again, it's a very narrow lens about what that means. And so I ask people, so if you want to have a diverse workforce, why aren't you addressing some of these workplace policies that will bring more people like women of color into the workforce? So I'm trying to expand their lens on that one, but I've been kind of amazed at how narrow it's viewed in the corporate world.
Yeah, I think we have seen some of that in social media, where we have seen, calls for, more diversity and equity, more inclusion, but we have seen some of these same organizations not necessarily, when you see the workforce, or you've spoken, well, I say spoken, when people speak out via social media, they talk about their experiences and the culture of the environment, and it's often telling, because it tells a different story. Even more so in the diversity and inclusion lens, we still have to be cognizant of our differently abled folks, and these folks that come from, we have closed captioning here and some of these other things that perhaps, again, we often don't see as it relates to diversity and inclusion. And so we want to make sure that, again, the more folks we get at the table, the more cognizant of these things and that will be, and then we'll have a better understanding of how they intersect with some of those other barriers, like being a woman or being a person of color.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both for sharing those ideas, your programs, your wisdom on all of that. I think for me personally, listening to this web conference has really helped me make those concrete ties between these, bigger policies or, just broader initiatives and what that means for preventing violence. So I really appreciate both of you sharing all of that. You've definitely inspired a lot of folks in the text chat. It's actually been kind of hard to keep up with while you both have been talking. So, folks are really enjoying the conversation today and have a lot of ideas from what you had shared about what are some policies that are related to both economic justice and to preventing violence. So we are heading towards the end of our web conference. And before we let you all go today, we want to leave you with this question. Where do you see opportunities to expand your sexual and intimate partner violence prevention work to connect with economic justice? So feel free to use the last couple minutes to answer that in the text chat, marinate on it for the rest of the day or the week or however long. Casey and Arlene, do you want to jump back in and let us know about the resources you have?
Yes, if I could, very briefly, we just wanted to share some of the relevant resources that we have to offer at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And thanks so much. The chat has just been so engaging. I really enjoyed the presentations today. I'm loving the energy that everybody seems to be pouring into this. And I love hearing from all these friendly faces. I did want to point out that our TA question of the month that is going to be posted on Bonnet for August was authored by staff of the Delaware Coalition. I see Sarah Bear is participating in today's web conference, but the authors of this particular TA question are Nikki Kress, Brooke Ophart, and Sierra Bryant. So exploring many of the strategies that I've seen shared in the chat today around economic justice as a prevention strategy. So we want to call your attention to be on the lookout for that. And, you know, I think many of you are familiar with some of the resources that we offer, but really encourage you to connect with us if there's something you're looking for or ways that we can support your work. Arlene, was there anything else that you wanted to share?
Unmute. No, we'll also share our preventipv.org link in the chat, so folks can go there for resources as well.
I want to thank you all again for a great conversation. Thank you for everyone who joined us today and for all of your energy and participation in the text chat. These web conferences would really mean nothing without you. So just so much appreciation to you all. This will end our web conference for today, and I wish you all a healthy and good rest of your Tuesday afternoon. So thank you all so much. Take care. We'll see you soon.